have everybody on?
Yes.
No, no, it's only our audio and their audio is on. Oh, there it is. Excellent.
There we go.
Got it. Let's record.
All right. We're all set.
For those of you on the East Coast, good afternoon. And for those of you elsewhere, good morning. It's always a good idea to start out a webinar with talking about sexuality. And I'm very pleased today to have both Dr. Angela Kuemmel and Dr. Brian Letourneau, almost Dr. Brian Letourneau, the soon-to-be. Both of them, but especially Dr. Kuemmel, have been working in the area for a while. And without further ado, Dr. Kuemmel and Brian, go for it.
Okay, thanks everyone. So we're really excited to be here to present on this topic today. So sexuality is a interest that Brian and I both share. And a lot of the experience and some of the material that we're sharing with you today, we actually have a sexuality intervention program here at the Cleveland VA. Brian co-facilitated it with me during his rotation with me on SCI. And we've learned so much from developing that program and doing that program. And as we'll share with you in the course of this talk, the cohort that Brian facilitated with me was one of the most challenging I've ever had. And they were constantly putting Brian and I on the spot with their questions about sexuality. And we really appreciated it. So we're going to be sharing with you some of the things that we learned from this. So, all right. So why do we care about this topic? First of all, acquired disability can significantly affect both sexual activity and intimate relationships. In addition, rehabilitation psychologists are invested in overall quality of life, okay? And sexual satisfaction is an important component of that. Assessment of sexuality and intervention are ABRP competencies. We want to give a shout out to those who are board certified and those who are the future ABRPs. Understanding and demonstrating competence in sexuality is an important part of that process. And then finally, we got a few positive comments about the title of our talk today. And we were inspired by the music of the 90s, as some of you can appreciate. But we are also trying to get a catchy title so that we could get people here to this webinar. All right, so here's some bad news. In terms of, so this webinar was initially designed for students and trainees, although we did broaden it when we saw the shout out go out to the whole Division 22 listserv. But for psychology students, they're lacking most in terms of quantity and quality of sexual health training compared to other health professionals students, okay? And this is despite the fact that psychologists, and something Brian and I, one of our take home points today, is sexuality is really an area where psychologists can be leaders, and it's a role that's really important, okay? So, so students really need to have more preparation and information related to sexuality and disability. And like I said, when I saw this, my reaction was yikes, okay? Now, so why is talking about sex with patients hard? Okay, so the first thing is that it makes people, it's an uncomfortable topic, okay? And this is for a variety of reasons. It's a very sensitive topic. And in addition, something that we could have talked to you all day about today is the fact that healthcare professionals they've not received formal training in this area. They're unfamiliar with the topic, and as a result of that, they don't feel comfortable. And another that got a yikes reaction from me, in the next couple of slides, 2 studies that just came out, research studies, in the latter half of 2017 are going to demonstrate this, and we'll go over those. Okay, so in terms of sexuality, so people have different backgrounds, beliefs, education about the topic, so that can make it hard. And then, so one thing that's hard about working with patients with disabilities is this isn't like a one-size-fits-all. So a lot of the information today we got through our work with patients with spinal cord injuries. A lot of it is probably going to be helpful, some of it may not, okay? So because there's so many diverse issues across the different disabilities, You really need a vast area of knowledge if you work with a wide variety of disability diagnoses, and so that's challenging. And then the other thing is that something that we all need to own, we have biases about people with disabilities. We also have biases about people when it comes to people with disabilities and sexuality, okay? So like, for example, older adults can't or don't have sex, or they don't want to have sex. Another bias that really kind of made me grimace, a study that was recently published, I think it was in November of last year, about healthcare providers' experience working with traumatic brain injury patients. So like 90% of the providers in the survey thought that the TBI patients should focus on physical and cognitive recovery, not sexuality, okay? And something that I think we're gonna get into later, clinical readiness is key. The clinical readiness of the patient is key when you're talking about sexuality with patients, but it's also really important to realize that they may not have another opportunity other than when you see them in a rehab setting. Okay, now here's where I was telling you statistics aren't gonna lie. So talking about sex is hard. And again, these are 2017 research studies, just one in August, one in November, okay? So we pulled an article, and Brian and I actually used this as a journal club opportunity for our ALS team. And this was the first time we as a team had talked about sexuality. So consider doing something like that. You work on a team, because these two articles could open up fantastic discussions about people's biases and how they feel about disability and sexuality, okay? So here's some stats. So 80% of ALS patients in this study reported nobody had discussed it with them or inquired if they were having any problems. So we work here at the Cleveland VA, nationally certified ALS center, so we had to go through like an accreditation visit. I did a search for sex in the chart record of our patients. Psychology was the only discipline that had addressed sex with our ALS patients, okay? 75.3% of clinicians were unaware of strategies and interventions related to sexual difficulties, and half of those people reported feeling uncomfortable addressing them. Now I'm moving on to this study about professionals who work with people with TBI. So 83% of those professionals reported not having any specific courses. 61% reported not taking any type of action in their clinical practice related to sexuality after TBI. Like, those numbers are pretty alarming. And then 70% of people who TBI reported they knew little information on issues related to sexuality, and they believe it affected the way they communicated with their patients and then ultimately the care that the patients got. All right, so despite the fact that that made me go yikes, there's also good news, a silver lining. So the ALS clinicians, they said that if they were given information, they would feel comfortable discussing it. Something else that's cool, and this is why one of the things to think about doing is educating your whole team on sexuality, okay? So the ALS patients reported they would be comfortable speaking to any qualified health professional on their team, okay? That was 38%, or the health professional with which they had the best rapport. And that's why I said this should be a team discussion. And that's an area that psychology can definitely be a leader. And then despite the fact, so everyone agrees, despite the fact that they're uncomfortable and they don't know what to do, the good news is they do agree at some point. So when Brian and I found this article and we went to the team leader to talk about, to say, hey, we found this really great article, our team was incredibly receptive to us leading a journal club on this. Okay, so all TBI professionals believe the expression, so similar to ALS, the professionals believe it's important and it can contribute to quality of life, they don't know what to do. All right, so we wanted to put this in the presentation pretty early on because this is something that we hope a take-home point will be. So what can psychology do? So first of all, raise the topics with the patients and the team. Remember, patients said that they would feel comfortable discussing with any qualified provider. Be open to discussing a very personal subject. Be aware of our own personal biases. Everyone's sexual preferences are different and explore them. Okay, so I wanted to give a shout out to Linda Mona, just published a fantastic article in the American Psychologist, and she gives you a fantastic list of questions to explore your biases. that would be an awesome activity that you could do with a student group. You could do this with your team, and you don't necessarily need to have people volunteer their answers if they don't want to, but get them thinking about it, because these biases can definitely influence the care that the patients get. Okay, so remember that we teach people how to communicate. So this is not only like a clinical issue, it's also a communication issue. And communication, like teaching patients to communicate about their disability to prospective partners, is really important. And then again, like provide education about sexuality following disability and illness. So you can do this with your patients, you can do this with your team. Okay. Now, so what do you do if you are someone who feels like you need to build competence and confidence in this area? So recognize and realize these discussions can be awkward. So I said this when I gave this talk last year. So when students come here to train with me, I will not sign off on a report unless they've addressed sexuality with a patient, okay? So for some of the students who come through our training program, they don't have a good background in disability and sexuality. And something that one of my interns shared with me is that he just had to accept and realize that these discussions can be awkward, and he had to feel okay with awkwardness, okay? And that's something that really helped him. So another thing that you've got to realize is no one knows everything about disability and sexuality. It's okay not to know, and it's okay to own that. So a story that we were really looking forward to sharing today. So this cohort of our sexuality program that Brian and I ran last fall, they literally just had question after question after question for us. They questioned the research we were presenting, like, well, how do they define sexual satisfaction after spinal cord injury? And Brian and I literally had to sit up in front of them and say, we have no idea, we don't know, but we're gonna go, we will go do the research, consult with the team, we will come back to you with any information we can find. Another thing that demonstrates the fact that sometimes psychology can be the go-between, the same group of patients, they had so many questions about erectile dysfunction medication, and Brian and I quickly realized we did not know enough about this, okay? So we were literally going to the pharmacist on our staff every week with questions about different ED meds. So one of these weeks, I was just like, this is just becoming a pattern, like, why don't I invite the pharmacist to come to our program as like a guest speaker? So the pharmacist reacted, she got a little flustered, and she said, well, what if I don't know the answers to the questions that the patients have? And I literally shrugged my shoulders, and I told Brian, I was like, this is what we deal with every week, and it's totally okay that you don't know the answers to these questions. So that's a way that psychology can really help facilitate this process. Okay, so I've learned a lot from working with patients on these different issues, and I'm learning that even if I don't have the answers, and I own that, like, the patients are okay and they appreciate that I'm caring enough to ask them, okay? Working with, so getting supervision on this topic if you are a student, consulting with colleagues, and remembering that within Division 22, people are really open and receptive. Like, there have been times, I don't know, when I was first developing my Passion Milo security intervention, like, the first person I wanted to talk to was Linda Mona, and she was so receptive to help me with that. So just remembering that if you feel like you're in over your head, or you're at a site where you don't feel like anyone has this expertise, so just remember your Division 22. Okay. Finally, something that else is really important is that on this topic, you have to sit down, read the articles, read the books. There's great blogs on sexuality. I don't have any examples from social media this year, but there are great resources out there. And then every single person on this webinar, if you have not watched the Mitch Tepper videos and you work with people with spinal cord injuries or other physical disabilities, you should really watch them. And is at the end of our presentation, only because and these videos are great. They're a really good, like, visual demonstration of how sex after spinal cord injury would work. And everyone keeps their clothes on, so they're very patient and provider friendly. Okay. So, all right. So we're going to move into, so how do you approach sexuality with patients with disabilities? So thinking about, it isn't just what we've seen in the movies. So after acquired disability, you really have to expand, you may have to expand your definition how you defined sexuality after acquired disability and get away from both like cultural and clinical definitions, thinking about it as an individual experience, and that intimacy really involves two people who will be partners, pleasing each other, sharing any way that they can. Now, so thinking about how to define sex. So yes, sex is physiological factors that compromise performance of sexual activity. And that's why we really want to focus more on the definition of sexuality, pertaining to intimacy within relationships and need to experience this oneself as a sexual being, the experience of emotional closeness and pleasure. So sex definitely falls within this realm, but really opening it up. Okay, so there are some important myths about disability and sexuality that we wanted to go over. Because, so when people hold these myths, so we realized with one of the reasons our last cohort was so difficult was because they held a lot of these myths, okay? So realizing, so the myth that people with disabilities are not sexual beings, they're not desirable, they can't have real sex. Again, really getting them to widen their definition, are not good choices for partners. And we go over the myths with our patients and we talk about, you know, do you subscribe? Do you believe any of these things? Do you believe they're real, not myths? And why are they myths and how are they impacting them? Okay, so we don't begin in the bush up here in Cleveland. So should be focused on they should be focused more on their medical and physical recovery, not on sexuality. They should be focused on other things. In institutions, they should be having sex, and sex should be spontaneous. So these are all myths, okay? I believe I have a couple more slides, and I'll turn it over to Brian. All right, now, so the basics on sexual health and disability. So one of the reasons that it can be difficult or, you know, people are like, should we really be addressing sexuality? Is early on, if you're in an acute rehab unit, it's difficult to comprehend bodily changes. You may have patients that are barely adjusting to their disability. They may be in denial. They may be focused on recovery. So this is where you really have to use your clinical judgment and explore readiness. So if I have a patient who is definitely not ready to talk about disability and sexuality, something you want to be sure that they know is that I can help them with this. I can provide education. After acquired disability, everybody needs to build up their knowledge base. And that my offer to do this with them stands at any time. Okay, so sexual adjustment is a long-term process and involves many different factors. Just remembering that sex after disability is like the first time you ever actually do it. It can be very anxiety-provoking, especially if you're not sure how your body is going to respond or how your neurological disability is going to affect your sexual functioning. Most individuals lack desire or knowledge about how to ask for sexuality-related services. So here at the Cleveland VA, we have some, in the rehab psych circle, we do have some providers on this. So I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer, but my stance is that the provider should be the one to bring it up. You know, you can remember the Plimpton model. The first step is the P, the asking for permission, okay? There are other providers here who feel like you should wait for patients to bring it up. So there's benefits and disadvantages of both approaches. And then, so we already talked about how most people have limited education on this. All right, so sexual adjustment, what is that? So a change in sexual function is a real loss, and just like any other loss, you should acknowledge that. It involves letting go of what sex is supposed to be and focusing on who you can be. So the rehab psychologist, focus on what you can do rather than what you can't. So both members of a couple need to redefine their roles and realize that adjusting to sexual changes takes time. More experience leads to learning more about how the body responds and comfort with new sexuality. And something that's hard is both partners may adjust differently. One may be very eager to try different things and adaptive equipment, and another may not be ready for that. So you may have to realize that you need to work with both members of the partnership on sexual adjustment. Okay, now, so a really important concept, but to be honest, I felt like as much as I liked reading on disability and sexuality, I don't know that this was on my radar until a few years ago when Mitch Tucker, who, and we have the book in our reference list, this should be required reading for everyone because of how he talks about sexual esteem. So the multi-dimension sexuality questionnaire defines sexual esteem as positive regard for, confidence in, the capacity to experience one's sexuality in a satisfying and enjoyable way. Okay? So, as you can imagine, disability can affect this. Okay? So, realizing that sexual esteem is different from self-esteem. And again, you need to examine your own attitudes and beliefs and then help the patient examine their attitudes and beliefs about this. And what's super frustrating is, unfortunately, like with spinal cord injury, that's the area that there's research on disability and sexual esteem. So what you might need to do as clinical practitioners is get this information and think about how it applies to the different populations. Okay, so this is why sexual esteem. So again, there's such limited research on this. So Mitch Tepper, who's a sexologist with spinal cord injury, if you're not familiar with him, he sought to find what factors influence the ability to experience orgasm in patients with spinal cord injury. He had 2 patient groups in his study. And this was, again, our challenging cohort had so many questions on this. Brian went digging through his 350-page dissertation. That's how we got this information. It's not readily accessible. So there were 2 patient groups. So those who had achieved orgasm and those who hadn't. So something that people are continually baffled by is there are no significant differences in the level of your spinal cord injury or how complete it is. So for those of you who aren't familiar with spinal cord injury, that's basically saying that the function that you have and the injury level and the completeness of the injury, meaning how much sensation you have, that has nothing to do with orgasm, whether you experience that or not, okay? And then also how much you knew about sexuality didn't matter, or for sexuality. What mattered was there were significant differences in the time post-injury. So the longer time, the greater the chances you'd experience orgasm, and how you felt about yourself, like your positive regard for yourself as a sexual being. That was what influenced whether you experienced orgasm or not. Okay. I think this is my last slide.
Sure.
Okay. So factors affecting sexuality and disability. So realize that you can have neurological issues. And then to keep in mind that psychology can address other factors that affect everyone that sometimes supersede neurological issues, like smoking and drinking, cardiovascular, endocrine, and psychological function, including diabetes, obesity, depression, aging, and hormone factors. So basically, sometimes patients like to think or say that everything, like they kind of want to hinge all their difficulties with sexuality on their disability. And so a key here is to remember that that's not always the case.
All right. So to get into some of the more nitty-gritty details that might be for working with patients. So here, working in a VA, the majority of the patients that we see in our sexuality group are men, just the nature of the beast here. So I want to focus a little bit on male impotence because it comes up a lot, and then we'll get into more general information. So as psychologists, we can really help male patients with disability if they're experiencing erectile dysfunction or any other impotence issues. A lot of these you notice under the lifestyle modifications factors. Anyone in health or rehab psychology really can help. Doing counseling on smoking cessation, helping them manage their alcohol use, controlling diabetes, or really improving their overall health really can fall into our realm. And also it's helpful to be able to provide these patients with education about some of the tools that they could use. These are things like penis pumps or other vacuum devices, vibrators, medications like Viagra or Levitra or Cialis. There are also injections and more severe down the line penile implants that they can use. And we'll have a resource at the end of this that you can get a better idea of what all of these things look like. But you know, you might be thinking like, hey, I know a lot of these guys want to jump right to Viagra, for example. And that's, of course, out of our realm as psychologists because we don't prescribe that. But what we can do is work with them on helping make sure they understand what they need to do. So, for example, something that Angela and I learned cohort that we had is that Viagra works best if it's taken on an empty stomach, and it's not like guys can just pop the pill and boom, they're ready to go, right? They still need mental and physical stimulation in order to achieve an erection, which is something that a lot of people don't understand. So having that knowledge in your back pocket, you can pass that along to your patients and really could help improve their functioning and satisfaction. So Mitch Tepper brings up this point that one of the first sexual experiences that people have post-disability or post being diagnosed with a chronic illness is masturbation. So this is a pretty good thing to bring up with patients. You know, depending on patient's background, they might have different views on masturbation and whether they think it's right or wrong. From our perspective, it is a healthy and normal form of sexual expression. And it's especially popular following a disability or illness because there are so many other barriers maybe to having a sexual experience with another person, but masturbation, by definition, you do it yourself, right? You don't need to rely necessarily on other people to help you out with it. This could help people boost their sexual esteem by figuring out what works, what doesn't work, and other areas of their body that might respond differently than they have before. So a lot of people we have seen with spinal cord injuries have limited sensation, but they found out that maybe touch doesn't really work, but if they use pressure or friction or use a vibrator, they can get different sensations. And that can boost their esteem because they can go into working with a partner, having a better idea of how their body works now and what's going to work for them. So we mentioned a little earlier adaptive devices, and those can be physical or non-physical things. So when we're talking about a person with a disability and their partner trying to enhance their overall sexual pleasure, they can do things like using memory of past experience or fantasy to really get themselves in the mental and emotional state to engage in it. Becoming more bodily attuned and not really focusing on our genital arousal, but more overall body arousal. So like face or chest twitching, maybe tingling, goosebumps, that kind of stuff might be other indications of arousal if they're not able to get genital arousal right away. I mentioned incorporating these other sensory stimulations, so maybe things like movies or pictures or auditory erotic books or whatever they need to do to stimulate all the senses. And going into noticing other body areas that are aroused ties into exploring these erogenous zones where sensation might be spared. So this really comes into play with people with spinal cord injury who have that limited sensation, depending on where their injury level is. But you know, a lot of people can still notice, you know, their ears might be sensitive or their collarbones, necks, things like that that maybe get overlooked in people without disabilities might become a lot more important for people with disabilities. And then there are, as I mentioned earlier, numerous different devices and equipment out there. You can see on the slide the purple thing is part of the Liberator collection, which you can get on their website or on Amazon. Or actually, if you're working in a VA, a lot of times you can work with the occupational therapist and the patient can get the equipment at no cost, which is pretty cool. And that, again, ties into psychology's role as an intermediary between the patient and other providers. The other device on the screen is designed for one partner to lay on that mat, and the other partner who might have limited hip mobility can sit on that chair and it swings, so they can get going that way, I guess. But again, the important thing to talk with your patients about is this idea of being creative, experimenting, trying things out, and communication. So a lot of patients talk to us and say like, hey, what's the point? Like, I can't feel anything from my chest down, my waist down, whatever. And we like to remind them that your mouth probably works just fine. So your lips do have a lot of nerve endings and can get a lot of sensation from that. We're not talking just about kissing, but maybe kissing those other erogenous zones or doing other physical activities with that area of sensation. And as I mentioned before, really encouraging patients to explore their body, really trying to find every place that still has sensation, and again, different types of sensation. So friction, vibration, pressure, things like that. We like to encourage our patients to take turns being in charge. So one of the videos, I think it's on Mitch Tepper's website, one of the guys talks about, you know, when he first had his spinal cord injury and was getting physically intimate with some of his partners, he liked to be blindfolded, and not out of like a BDSM thing, but as he was totally giving up charge and letting his partner take control and really do what she wanted to him so he could experience that. So we talk to our patients about that, you know, giving over control and really going along for the ride, literally and figuratively.
And that really helps with like the role kind of like adjustment, because after spinal cord injury, we find that that's part of the sexual adjustment process. So kind of it's almost like a creative reframe.
Sure. And that ties into communication, which is coming up in a couple of slides. But one other big issue that patients bring up is like, hey, I want to orgasm. And I think a lot of people generally have kind of a narrow view of what an orgasm looks like, feels like, is. And we like to encourage our patients to expand the definition of what an orgasm could be. Because, you know, it's very likely that following an acquired disability, orgasm is not going to be the same as it was prior to the disability or the illness. So this could be, you know, tuning into all of the senses, again, like we talked about earlier, feeling different bodily sensations. And also the literature suggests that there are many different types of orgasms. So for women, it could be vaginal, clitoral, or both people, anal, different types of things. So really broadening that definition and having more of an open mind into it, which again, here, a lot of patients might be more uncomfortable talking about that, but just bringing up the topic and giving them either some psychoeducation on it or just room to know that you're a safe person that they can talk to and explore when they're ready. Mitch Tepper, of course, comes out with a list of orgasm tips. And some of these you can look at and see, like, yeah, this kind of makes sense. And some of them might be a little less on the forefront of your mind. So he got these results with surveys from that original group. So in his dissertation, the orgasm versus non-orgasm group, he asked the participants in the orgasm group what helped them achieve orgasm. There are things that we can certainly help out with as psychology. So feeling sexy ties into that sense of sexual esteem. Relaxation, of course, we can help with that. Meditation, really getting calm, engaging in fantasy, dreams, memories. Focus on breathing, again, expanding that definition of orgasm and tying it into other physiological functions. It helps if people just go with the flow and understand that this sexuality following a disability is going to be a learning process and just, you know, try it and see what happens. Trust turned out to be a really big part. You know, having trust with your partner can really help achieve orgasm. And that goes into not just trust in the sexual aspect of your relationship, but in general. Trusting that person that you're with and that you can really feel okay with them. Also not rushing it and taking the time to explore these different things, realizing that, you know, the first few times you engage in sex after a disability, it might not happen. You can probably say that for people without disability too, but giving yourself that time to, you know, go with the flow. And again, not being afraid to use those devices or stimulators, vibrators, anything else to change the experience. So some important issues that we brought up so far, but that warrant a little extra talking about. Anxiety. A lot of people with disabilities are going to be anxious thinking about sex. You know, like Angela mentioned, there tends to be this attitude of, I need to focus on my physical rehabilitation. I don't need to worry about sex. Once they get pretty okay with that physical rehab and start thinking about sex again, it can be very anxiety. And like Angela mentioned, having sex the first time following a disability can be like having sex the first time ever. So a lot of, you know, anxiety, tension, and that ties into those tips that I just mentioned about having an orgasm, helping people with relaxation and feeling comfortable and trusting. A lot of expectations go into it. So especially for people who have sexual experiences prior to their disability might expect sex to be the same or expect that they know what the outcomes of sex is going to be like. And that might be very different, and those expectations might need to be adjusted following disability. Timing of it, this ties into things like bowel and bladder care, and making sure that you're really setting yourself up for success. And a lot of the patients that we see here can be very embarrassed about having a bowel or a bladder accident when they're trying to be intimate with a partner. So talking about different ways to manage that. As Angela mentioned earlier, there's this myth that sex needs to be spontaneous, and that's not true for anybody, but especially not true among people with disabilities who might need to do things like taking Viagra or doing a penile injection, or if they need the help of an aide to help get them undressed, do their bowel care, get them set up. So really thinking about planning this out. And again, communication, which I'm going to get into in a second. Now, so as we mentioned earlier, and seems to be the underlying theme that's driving along here, communication about sex can be hard. It can be hard not only for patients and their providers, but also for patients and their partners. But this is absolutely necessary. So if you think about it, you know, we mentioned that there are these myths that people have, that people with disabilities aren't interested in sex, don't want sex, shouldn't be focusing on sex. If providers have those viewpoints and patients have those viewpoints, it's probably pretty likely that their partner might also have that viewpoint and think that, you know, my partner's dealing with this other medical thing, they don't want me, they don't want to do this, and that will not be the case. So helping our patients, you know, find the words to say what they want to say to their partner, or figure out communication skills to make it a safe and productive dialogue can be really important. And that ties into the next point, where these, poor or absent communication leads to these incorrect assumptions about what their partners want or what they can do. As we know, and psychologists, communication involves speaking and listening. So there nearly needs to be this two-way street between the person with the disability and their partner, and helping them to understand each other. And as we tell our patients a lot, communication is more than words. So attuning to nonverbals, attuning to the setting that they're in can really facilitate productive conversation. So Angela touched on this briefly earlier, but when we're talking about sexuality among disability and chronic illness, we're not only talking about there needing to be adjustment for the patient, but also for their partner if they have an existing partner. So a lot of the guys who are in our sexuality group here were married or had a monogamous relationship. So their partner was going through a similar adjustment. So psychology's role can really tie into this, helping both the patient understand what their partner is going through, and also working directly with the partner to help them understand what's going on here. So like Angela mentioned, this disability and sexuality within that can be a big loss. So giving the partner that time for grieving and understanding that, hey, I just lost, what could have been a major part of our relationship. How are we going to change this? What's it going to be like going forward? Talking about taking the pressure off, managing expectations for what sex is going to be like from going forward, and helping them, communicate what their own needs are. Maybe there needs to be some give and take there with them, make sure they're satisfied as well. And also, if the patient's partner doesn't really know what's going on with them, or doesn't have a good attitude about their own sexual esteem, that can rub off on their partner. So again, working with the patient to teach them, like, hey, if you really don't see yourself as or desirable, or you don't think anyone's going to want to have sex with you, what makes you think your partner's going to want you? This turns into the self-fulfilling prophecy type thing. And tying into that poor communication, the partner might not know what the patient wants, what the patient can do. A lot of patients around here express that other people think they're fragile now and are afraid of touching them or moving them or anything, and that's a lot of times not the case. So teaching the patient how to communicate that to their partner and help that out. And lastly, there may be these other relationship issues that are leading into this. So kind of like how, we say, like, having a baby is probably not going to help bring a relationship back together. Having sex isn't necessarily going to help bring this fraught relationship back together. We actually had an example of this. One of the vets in our cohort this last time, we were talking to him about all these different things, communication, like Viagra, this, that, and the other thing. And we ended up getting an email from his wife saying that they had long-standing relationship problems before his spinal cord injury. She was seeing a therapist. I think they had done couples counseling. So there was this whole backdrop, and she was telling us, like, yeah, bringing his sexual esteem up and giving him Viagra is not going to help this marriage. So keeping that in mind too, and feeling comfortable doing some of that couples intervention, or having the resources to refer that couple out to really help them strengthen their relationship before we start asking them to be patient and trusting and try out all these new things. If they're not in a place to do that, really not setting them up for success.
Just one other tidbit about that story. So just being open to that needs to be there for the family members as well. And so this wife had sat through all the sessions that we gave. She was obviously not comfortable bringing this up in a meeting, and so she decided to email us, even rather than call us. So just being open to different ways to offer yourself up for questions and ways to address concerns.
Another role that we can play in this is self-promotion, talking with people about their sexual health. So just because you have a disability doesn't mean you can't get an STD or an STI. So talking with patients about that, I think a lot of times we tend to defer that to the physician or other healthcare providers. But we also know that patients don't always follow the advice of their physicians, or they don't understand, or they don't. We think it was brought up, but it wasn't. So kind of doing that psychoeducation piece around that. And also reminding patients that a pregnancy might still be possible. So you want to encourage them to use contraception if they're not trying to have a family, or if they are, helping either talk to them about pregnancy or getting them hooked up with resources that are familiar with pregnancy and disability, which unfortunately, especially for women with disabilities, can be a huge issue in and of itself. But still, being that middle person, shuttling between providers and the patients can really help. And also considering things like allergies, like if you're talking to your patients, telling them to use a condom, that's great, but not so much if they're allergic to latex and they're getting a latex condom. So just keeping those things in mind. Again, we as educated professionals might go in with a lot of this background information and think it's common sense, but some of our patients might not have that. So again, understanding our own biases and expectations and interpretations of things going in, and meeting the patient where they are and having important conversations with them can be very vital. So as trainees, or even if you're a practicing professional and you don't have a lot of experience with this, we mentioned the importance of getting supervision or consulting with other people. Now, that can be really easy and really comfortable when your supervisor is on board and says like, yeah, let's do this. It can be less so if you have a supervisor who has those old attitudes that people with disabilities shouldn't be focusing on sex. B, has their own biases sex and says, hey, this person's an older adult, why do they need to be having sex anyway? Or has the attitude of, well, it's not our job to bring this up. If the patient wants to talk about it, they need to be the one to bring it up, which, experience tells us that that's probably not going to happen because it's an uncomfortable topic. So what do you do in that case? Like Angela mentioned, people in Division 22 are very open to talking about this. So consulting with either other supervisors on site or reaching out to other experts in the field. Angela mentioned, it really, unfortunately, falls on us to have to educate ourselves about this. So things like the different books that we'll talk about, manuals, listservs, journal articles, trying to learn as much as we can. And also, potentially meeting your supervisor in the middle and focusing on aspects of this that your supervisor might be comfortable with. So, we talked a lot about the importance of communication. So chances are your supervisor will probably be okay with you working with patients about how to best bring up this topic with their spouse or with their healthcare provider, helping them manage anxiety or manage any chronic pain that might have, or again, working with those relationships. So that's something that obviously is going to be supervisor specific, but it's very important. At the end of the day, we're really focusing on patient care, and if this is something that is really going to impact their life and is very important to them, it's really our job to figure out a way to do that. And also a point, we talk a lot about how this can be really awkward to bring up with patients and to address it. In the time that I've been here since August, I've asked every patient about it, and I've had one person not want to talk about it. He told me it was none of my business. He also was kind of cantankerous in general. He told me he likes sport, so I said, what's your favorite team? And he's like, all of them. So I don't really expect much out of him anyway, but just as a small sample size, but people, they might not want to dive right into it right then, but I think there is a lot of appreciation that we're bringing the topic up. So this drives home, this was a quote by this book back in 1992, and basically telling people with disabilities to concentrate on that mutual pleasure, trust, having patience, figuring out what your physical limitations are, and really being adaptive to it, and really trying to figure out new things to meet your partner's needs too, and not be selfish in the sexual relationship. Having that positive attitude, and of course having a sense of humor. And that's something that when we talk to patients who have learned about adapting their sexuality and have gone out and experienced sexual experiences, most of the time they say like, yes, things went wrong here or there, and you kind of have to laugh it off and move on, and just keep trying, and eventually something should work. So a couple good resources that we have out here that we wanted to share that have been really helpful for us, and they're all pretty accessible. So the one on the left, Regain That Feeling, that's Mitch Tepper's book. So as Angela mentioned, he has a spinal cord injury and writes very candidly about his experience having sex after spinal cord injury. It's a very easy to read book. I think you could recommend it to your patients, but certainly as a professional, it's a good one to look at. And I think it's like $10 on Amazon, so it's pretty cheap. The one in the top right is Sex and Intimacy for Wounded Veterans. So that focuses a lot on people with amputations or TBI. So it certainly is not limited only to veterans. Of course, all sorts of people have those types of injuries. That one is really helpful because, again, really easy to read, but also includes a lot of cartoon drawings of adaptive equipment or people having sex while using prosthetic devices or different sorts of equipment, which can help you get a better sense of what this might look like. And again, might be something that's worth passing on to patients who are experiencing similar things. The one on the bottom right, the Pleasure Able device manual, that's actually a PDF online if you Google it. It's free. And that is all sorts of different devices. More devices than you could possibly imagine are in that manual, and are ways to educate yourself about it and educate your patients about it, and even encourage them if they think something might try. And there's seriously devices for any possible thing you could want. So it's worth checking out. They also mentioned the videos that Mitch Tepper has on his website. You can see the URL there. You can also just Google Mitch Tepper videos and it comes up. His, like Angela mentioned, they're all people who are fully clothed, so it's appropriate. But they go through different things like positioning guides for both men and women with disability, so you can see how that might change depending on who the person with the disability is. He also does really good talks on the devices for erectile dysfunction. So he has a model and he shows how men would do the injection or use the penis pump, and talks a lot about that, which is a really helpful demonstration to see that in an appropriate environment. Any other resources off the top of your head?
No, but these are really like must read. So if you haven't seen or read these, you should run right out and buy them and get them.
I think that's it. So if anybody has any questions, I think we have a little bit of time for that.
Yeah, first of all, I would like to thank the both of you. So thank you to Brian Letourneau and to Dr. Angela Kuemmel. I also realized I was remiss in not thanking the Nova Southeastern University chapter of the National Student Leadership Network for putting this together. As was just said, we're opening it up to questions both from the audience here in Fort Lauderdale as well as to anyone listening.
Yeah, and we can see the chat for anyone who's dialed in remotely if you type your question in the chat window.
Good. Yeah, one of the things I wanted to bring up to the both of you is that in listening to your wonderful overview as well as your tips, it also occurred to me that this is also quite applicable to people who are living without the benefit of a disability. And I was wondering if the two of you could say a few words about that.
I think so too. I mean, certainly the points we talk about sexual esteem, communication, or even people with disability might have some of those erectile dysfunction, impotence type things. So it could be really helpful, and that's something Angela and I talked about as kind of a limitation to the Passion Milo group that we run here, is that it is focused only on the people with disabilities and not the partners who don't. So if there's another way to reach that out, or again, that's why we kind of wanted to make this presentation appeal to people inside and outside rehab psych, because like you mentioned, Barry, like other people without disabilities might present to you and say, hey, I'm having this sexual problem, help. And there are a lot of common denominators that can tie into it.
And we have a question from the audience. And so Brian, why don't you, because Brian actually went looking for this answer.
Yeah, so the question is, when Mitch Tepper found that relationship between the time since injury and ability to orgasm, was the time a continuous variable, or was there an official cutoff? So I believe it was a continuous variable. And off the top of my head, the people who reported that they had orgasm were, I think, 8 to 12 years post spinal cord injury. So when we told that to our group, the jaws kind of dropped, because they're like, I have to wait 8 years to have an orgasm. And it's like, no, because keep in mind, I mean, this study, he didn't start enrolling these participants right after their spinal cord injury. They were people who had already had it that he lumped them into his cohort. So they were all varying lengths of time since their spinal cord injury. But it seems like kind of the longer it goes, for whatever reasons, that he didn't really tease it apart. It's hard to say whether it's that length of time that actually helped, or if it took these people 8 years to figure out, that pressure, friction, vibration, all the different adaptive equipments are out there, and that contributed to it. Or if it took them, that long to really build up their sexual esteem again. It could be a number of things, but that's a good question. And that's what we had to really talk to our group about, and say, hey, we're not telling you that you're going to live 12 years without an orgasm. We're just saying this is what's out there. And unfortunately, there isn't much research out there to go off of. So that's what we had.
A good question.
The other distinction that you guys pointed out, which I think is crucial, is for everyone, providers and partners and people living with it, to remember the difference between the physical acts of sex and the idea about sexuality as sharing intimacy. I thought that was very, very important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a pretty easy thing, we gave you guys the definition, so we're fine. Actually, I don't think we sent this PowerPoint out, but we're absolutely fine doing that, because there's a lot of things that you guys could easily pull from the PowerPoint and start using. I've started using that tips to orgasm sheet, with patients. And so yeah, that's really important. It's really easy. And it's real helpful.
All right, so if there are no other questions, I would like to remind people, please spread the word that we will be putting out a link to this webinar as soon as we get it set up, so that it will be available to people who are not available during this time period. And again, thanks to both Brian Letourneau and Dr. Angela Kuemmel, as well as to the NSU chapter of the Student Leadership Network. And the Nova Southeastern chapter will be putting out webinars on a monthly basis, so stay tuned for the next one. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. I'm scared.
We have 26 people, and
I'm going to pause it.
for those of you who don't know, a lot of the